and most people residing in Germany think that climate change is one of the most significant problems facing humanity and that something needs to be urgently done about it. Indeed, we have seen social movements, perhaps some of the largest social movements that Germany has seen in its recent past, emerge in the form of Fridays for Future, Students for Future, and Extinction Rebellion. There have been a lot of critiques of these movements situated in Germany and elsewhere, which have actually asked some of the fundamental questions which concern the majority world. Some of these questions I will take up in this short video presentation. My name is Mihir Sharma, and I am a research associate and graduate student at the Bayreuth International Graduate School for African Studies and a member of the research group Anthropology of Global Inequalities at the University of Bayreuth. I also write about social movements, anti-racism, race, and environmental politics. How white are the climate movements? This question was raised by many Black and person of color activists in the German-speaking regions last year, but this was by no means the first time that these questions were raised about mainstream movements that claim to speak for a universal subject. When mainly Afro-German, Black, and people of color activists brought up the question, how white are the climate movements? This was not the first time that these questions were being raised, and definitely not the first time that these questions were being raised to a majority white-dominated movement by Black and people of color coalitions and groups. Let's dig into this question a little deeper. What do activists mean when they say white? How white are the climate movements? Whiteness has a very long history and a very complex one as well. It is not possible in such a short video to summarize that history, but I will try and situate this history and its consequences to the extent that is relevant for our situation here in Berlin, in Germany, as people of color, as people in Black and people of color coalitions, as part of environmental movements. So it is now common sense, right, in the liberal democratic world that race has no biological basis. Social scientists since then have critiqued race by calling it a social construction. So if it is something that is socially constructed by certain interests and not others, then the idea goes that this construction can be undone, can be deconstructed, that we could actually think of a world without racist hierarchies, racist oppression, racist exploitation, and so on. So some have also called race a fiction which has deadly consequences, or as the thinker W.E.B. Du Bois famously stated at the first Pan-African conference in London in 1900, he said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Indeed, race has been a very important and deadly category for racialized peoples, and the consequences have had to be borne by people who, against their will, were racialized into categories across the world through settler and other forms of colonialism. But to think of colonialism as a museum, as something in the past, is doing injustice to the ongoing processes of exploitation and super exploitation, as well as the ongoing injustices which have colonial continuities which either never ended or were even exacerbated by neo-imperialist and neo-colonialist forms which emerged as the battles for self-determination in the majority world. The majority world is often also called the Global South. Whether it is the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on African Americans in the United States, on indigenous people in Peru, or Dalits and Adivasis in South Asia, racialization, and racism have had ongoing deadly effects and consequences which are intergenerational for racialized persons and communities. The centrality of class politics in German speaking regions has often overshadowed concerns of racism, especially when it comes to questions of the global division of labor and migration. The Afro-German scholar Fatima El-Tayeb has attributed the absence of an analysis of race and racism to what she calls the ongoing myth of colorblindness. This, she argues, has informed common sense understandings of race in Germany and other parts of Europe. White Europe's inability to recognize its history of invisible racialization, she argues, is an act of amnesia which denies racialized minorities a past and, one might argue, a place on the stage of negotiating both the present and the future. So, when race is not forgotten, it is sometimes thought of as just another form of discrimination, akin to xenophobia, or in German, Fremdenfeindlichkeit. Now, the thing with Fremdenfeindlichkeit or xenophobia is that anybody of any group, regardless of the power and the position they hold in society, could be fremdenfeindlich towards one another. Whereas racism, as a structure of white supremacy, where people who are marked and positioned as white seek to gain from structural, institutional, and everyday forms and levels of intergenerational, historical racializations of people of color and black people and indigenous people, is a completely different analysis from the analysis of xenophobia. So that would be the first point in discussing racism in the German-speaking context.